I'm talking about how immigration, mass immigration, really feeds radical Islam in America. And this topic, when I was thinking about writing about it and talking about it, reminded me a moment that I had on CNN, when I was on CNN. And it's not the one that I became most famous for. It was from an earlier episode. I was discussing the vote in Michigan ahead of the 2024 election. And we were talking about the fact that there is a very large Muslim population in Michigan. And I said that come mid next decade in this country, there will be more Muslims than there are Jews. It's just a fact because of mass immigration. And because they live in more important swing states, Michigan, Minnesota, Georgia, where they make up half of the percentage of the population, 55,000, North Carolina, where they make up 1%, their vote will matter more than the interests of many Jewish Americans who do not live in important swing states, and they do not have as much of a swing vote overall. And I said, if Donald Trump won Michigan because of the Muslim vote split their vote, the Democratic Party would wipe away the remaining veil they had of supporting our ally Israel and making this a bipartisan issue. This would no longer be a bipartisan issue. The Democrats would go full on Hamas and kind of drop the veil. Well, mass immigration, the idea that mass immigration would change the fabric of our country, would change our body politic in an irreversible way, specifically negative to the interests of Jewish Americans, especially those who stand with Israel, not all Jewish Americans. There are a couple of big anti-Israel ones. Well, a co-panelist of mine on that episode of CNN was a Canadian woman named Leah McGowan, who, very nice liberal lady. I will say, first of all, she was a very nice, lovely person. And I can't say about everyone who was on CNN with, but she was insane. And she said, and I rewatched the clip to make sure I actually remembered her accurately, not just in my head. And she said, she would say things, by the way, that were constantly insane. One time she said to me on air, why don't you just forfeit this election and try again next time? Not a genius, but a very nice person. Well, when I mentioned this, just the idea of mass immigration, how it changed our politics, she said, how are Jews supposed to feel hearing what you said and not feel like someone is trying to attack them? Sometimes I assume people are on the same brain level as me, which is a mistake. And I just go into an autistic take of, well, this is true and here's the numbers, and not realizing they're actually in shock of what they've just heard being the truth because they're so rarely exposed to it. I forget that 90% of the country is mentally ill and obese and retarded. So I just sat there and said it's true and tried to explain numbers and demographics and immigration and interest groups, which she followed up by blinking at me like 900 times in 30 seconds and then said sure at the end of it. That was a perfect encapsulation in a minute of live television of what it's like to talk about mass immigration and its real effects on our politics to somebody who is never allowed to even hear it, never allowed to think about it, never allowed to say about it, not only because, they want to be invited to certain television shows and parties and whatnot that would never accept that, but also because their brains don't allow them to sit there and think that. Everyone is, equal. They were very much raised in free to be you and me 1970s thought process. But the truth about immigration and how it changes our politics regarding the Middle East is also how it changes our politics regarding our own country. The most radical thing when you sit there and hear about all these insane changes we're having, all these remarkable transformations of our electorate, is you have to remember that the federal government is endorsing this change. The federal government is actively doing this. This is not by an accident. This is not that it rained one day. The federal government made this choice. For those of you who don't know my work and don't know me and can't tell by everything about me, I was born, raised in New York City. I'm as New York as they come for generations. And I come from a stock in that city that helped build it, when Zora Mandani's family was still trying to figure out basic electricity. His ancestors. And we're almost 24 years to the day of the 9/11 attacks. And it's something that looms very, very large in my mind because I was not only living in New York when it happened. My mother worked in the World Trade Center. My father was a police officer, along with several of his brothers. And not to dwell on it too profoundly of the day, because I was one of the lucky ones, and everyone I loved came home, which I'm one of the few people I knew who can sit there and say that. Our leaders, our Republican president at the time, George W. Bush, turned around and made it known that this was not a war against Islam, which, fine, I accept. There's a lot of good Muslims. I understand why you would say that as a political leader. But what he did in response to that was he doubled our Muslim population living in this country. In a matter of 8 years, doubled it. And then Barack Obama, subsequent president, nearly doubled it again. Now, I have Muslim friends, and they're great people. A lot of them smarter than me, and I'm glad that they're here. I'm glad they're part of our country. But we're not talking about that we brought in a few good new doctors from Pakistan. We're not talking about the fact we brought in a few good people from this country, that country. We doubled it and then doubled it in a matter of 16 years. According to Pew Research, 60% of all Muslims living in America came after 9/11. That's probably actually lower because that happened. That number was in 2017. It's probably close to 2/3 or close to 70%. And this comes after the attacks on our country, attacks globally, $8 trillion spent on a global war on terror, 15,000 servicemen and contractors killed. Now, as is the case with most immigration pools, no matter who they are, most Muslims immigrants have not been terrorists. But since the first World Trade Center attack in 1993, there have been, from that attack until the terrorist attack, the Muslim terrorist attack on New Year's Eve in this country this year, which many of you probably have forgotten about. I know I did before reading up on it. The attack that happened in New Orleans, where a African-American convert to Islam drove his car through New Orleans streets, killing 14 people. There were over 140 successful and foiled Islamic attacks in a period of 31 years. Now, those attacks, the number of those attacks, both failed and successful, skyrocketed right after end of Bush's term, because he had increased the population substantially, and they increased further throughout Obama's term because he kept adding the fuel to the fire. Mass immigration matters. I'm not a rocket scientist. I'm not the smartest person probably in this room or that I know, and I know it's politically incorrect to sit there and say this, with the exception of just extreme vetting for a chosen few who really add to the fabric of our country. Why did our elites sit there and say it is important, it is a major issue to drive this population through the roof as the number of global terrorist attacks, the global intifada, the funding of terrorism cells throughout the entire world was increasing? They said, no, we need to also increase this population. To the elites who never live around most of these people, except an occasional doctor, their belief is they are enriching us. And let me be clear, we are lucky we are not Europe. They are in much worse position than we are. Since Teddy Kennedy and LBJ decided to destroy our country by putting forward the 1965 Immigration Act, we managed to get some of the best Muslims, especially in the 1970s and 80s, doctors and very smart people from Pakistan and Syria and Iran and Egypt and India. That was before we started parachuting refugees from Somalia and Afghanistan and Iraq throughout Maine and Minnesota. But we got a lot of really good, intelligent, college-educated Muslims in the first wave, because the way that immigration works in this country is if you are from an exotic population, exotic from the Native American stock, it's very hard to come here as the first one, right? You have to have a skill, you have to have connections, you have to come from some level of prosperity and a good position. The way it works after the first ones have come is you just have to know somebody. So I'll give you a strange statistic and a strange fact, is that our Moroccan population has more college degrees and advanced college degrees than our Japanese population. Moroccan Americans are actually have more advanced degrees than Japanese Americans do living in this country. Why is that? Because we have 150,000 Moroccan Americans and 1.6 million Japanese Americans. Our population of that group of Moroccans relative to their native population is 0.4% versus Japan's 1.3%. The smaller our immigrant population is to a host nation's, or native nation's rather, total population, the better those immigrants are. Another perfect example is India and Mexico. You'd much rather be living in Mexico than India, right? The GDP per capita is infinitely higher. But Indian Americans in this country are much, much better off. Why? We took in 0.3% of India's native population compared to 29% of Mexico's population. The more immigrants we get from a community, the more that they start looking like the community of their homeland. Why do I sit there and say that? Because the best part of immigration is scarcity. You want the fewest amount. You want people that are really, truly exceptional and not their lazy cousin who watches Cartoon Network all day. You don't want the pothead relative that we all have. You don't want the lazy fat one. You want the one who wants to be a doctor or an engineer. Because of chain migration through family reunification, our Muslim population, which has excelled compared to that of what Europe has had, is going to start looking very different very, very quickly because we are at a threshold. That number that I told you about earlier in the speech, where Jews will no longer be the largest religious minority group, they will be replaced by Muslim, estimated by 2035, it will be because of family reunification from some of the poorest segments of the world, from the worst parts of India and Pakistan, and any refugee who managed to come here during the great wave that Joe Biden led up during Afghanistan. If we had our Muslim immigrants until recently because once you get the citizenship, it's easier to bring more citizens over, and you're able to sit there and tie an entire tribe, an entire town, an entire village together. Sorry, I lost my space. So, that fundamentally changes our body politic, not just in the way of foreign policy, as I discussed earlier with Israel. It changes how we will be as a country domestically. If you look overwhelmingly at the recent protests of the last 5 years, yeah, there's a lot of white shit libs, right? I mean, we all can agree it's everyone's favorite target. Go watch cable news. They'll sit there and say these purple-haired, white shit lib, lesbian, trans, whatever. You all get the picture that they want to paint in your head as the real person causing all of these great left-wing pushes in society. And they're not wrong. There's a lot of them. That's not all of them. The people at the Mandani rallies did not, none of them, most of their ancestors did not come on the Mayflower. Most of their ancestors did not come on Ellis Island. Most of their ancestors did not come in the last maybe even 30 years. Mandani did not, right? The people protesting against in the campuses against free speech, the people who want hate speech control and gun right restrictions, the people who want to tear down Christopher Columbus statues, Zora Mandani being one of them, as he famously posted on Twitter, has been retweeted since then. The people who want to no longer be America, many of them our government is purposefully importing, and because of chain migration through family reunification, it's going to become much, much worse, much, much quickly. It is not all white shit libs. It is not all the most radical people. It's not all your, aunt who watches Rachel Maddow and really believes everything she says. It is the immigrants we are bringing into our community that sits there and changes the fabric of this country and is going to continue. The way that it transforms, the way that they are going to move within the country, they're doing it before they're even citizens. Mandani thought of changing our country before he was a citizen of this country. I cannot tell you how many people that I know in activism, or I've seen in activists rather, who are on the left, some are even on the right, who are not citizens. They're trying to be, they want to be, and they dream of changing this country in a way before they are even a member of it. It is outrageous. Mass immigration from anywhere is bad. But mass immigration from non-Western countries, especially over short periods of time, as we are seeing, fundamentally changes the fabric of our society in an irreversible way. We will no longer be America as we understand it if we continue. To paraphrase the great neoliberal politician of yesteryear, Hillary Clinton, immigration should be safe, legal, and rare. Thank you so much.